Let's bring in former Metropolitan Police Detective Chief Inspector David Spencer, who joins us now on the UK Tonight. Thank you so much for coming on to react to today's verdict. What was your initial reaction?
Good evening. Well, the first thing that strikes me is just how quickly the jury returned a verdict. It took less than 3 hours, which is very unusual, very quick for a verdict to come back from a jury like this. And I think it reflects what the jury must have thought about this case, which is that it was very, very clear that the officer was not guilty of what he'd been charged with. And I have to say, the conclusion I reached, particularly having seen some of the footage and some of the evidence that was presented in court over the last 3 weeks, but this was a trial that should never have been brought. There was never a realistic prospect of this officer being found guilty, which is the standard which the Crown Prosecution Service have to meet to decide to prosecute someone. And that's very clearly, certainly from what I've seen today, very clearly that was never going to be met. And certainly when we had at Policy Exchange, which I work at now, we had the Commissioner with us about a year ago talking about police officers being prosecuted. And he made clear that certainly in his view, that the police were being unfairly treated by the Independent Office for Police Conduct and the Crown Prosecution Service in these sorts of cases.
I'm interested to know why you think this should never have gone to court, because for Chris Kaba's family and community, Chris Kaba was shot in the head by a police officer. Regardless of the circumstances, that's something that needs investigating properly. So I'd be interested to know, and for you to explain to them, they will be listening tonight, why you think that should never have reached court.
Well, you're quite right. Of course, it should be investigated properly. And these cases are investigated in minute detail, in fact. But the threshold for any case to be prosecuted in court is whether there is a realistic prospect of a conviction, and certainly based upon the material which you've shown on Sky News this evening, and the jury, it would seem, agreed, having listened through 3 weeks of evidence, is that threshold was not met. And in fact, based on what we've seen today, I think it's very unlikely was ever going to be met. The reality is
there's a difference between, what you can present on television and, the full evidence provided to the CPS for them to decide to take it to court, because I just think it's important to remember tonight, yes, there are two sides involved in this, a police officer who's endured this for 2 years, who has been cleared today, but also the family and the community of a man who, as I said, was shot by a police officer. So, there is a reason why that went to court. I just want to talk to you about, what Chris Kaba's family had to say, and those representing them today. They have basically said that as a community, they feel silenced and marginalised. They had a sense that when this went to court, there was some faint hope there, but they pretty much always expected this kind of verdict. What are you thinking about, how the community will be feeling tonight about this verdict?
Let me say I'm hugely sympathetic to the family of Chris Kaba. I can only imagine the level of grief that they must be feeling. The reality is that police officers are sometimes called upon and have to use force, and they are held to account for it. And there is huge amounts of legislation which exist to judge the decisions of police officers that they make in a split-second decision. The reality is that the jury have said in this case, and based on what I have seen, I would agree with them, but you're right, of course, the jury sat through 3 weeks of evidence here, is that this officer was not guilty of murder, and that certainly seems to have been, from what I've seen, very clearly the case. And it's difficult to understand why this case was brought, given some of the evidence that we've seen, that the threshold was never going to be met. And the real problem here as well is the policy framework which officers are operating around, is that a lot of officers now simply do not have confidence in the system, that if they take action which needs to be taken to protect the public, that they will be backed up and looked after by the system that's supposed to look after them as well.
On that note, what next for the officer involved? Because, well, we haven't seen a picture of him released publicly. His name was put into the public domain, and, it's been pointed out that he's been through this for 2 years. He's been cleared today, but what next for him?
it will be hugely challenging. I think what I can say with confidence is that he will have the support of his colleagues. And by the sound of it, the Metropolitan Police Service, the Commissioner said that the officer in question has acted with considerable dignity over the last 2 years. So although it won't be clear exactly what happens with the officer next and where he goes and what his future holds, I know that he will be getting a considerable amount of support from his colleagues and by the sound of it, from the very top of the Met as well.
Yeah, life would never be the same for anyone involved in this. And just looking at the reaction from Chris Kaba's family tonight, they have got a verdict, but they are still looking for justice. You know, at that assembly we're looking at live in central London tonight outside the Old Bailey, they're saying no justice, no peace. What next for Chris Kaba's family?
There is no doubt this is a hugely tragic case. They will have this grief with them for no doubt the rest of their lives, and I'm hugely sympathetic to that. The criminal justice system has now given its verdict, and of course there will be questions about how the policy framework works, and there'll be questions about how the Met continues to try and build the confidence of people who it serves in London. And of course, those questions are still to be answered.
David Spencer, Head of Crime and Justice at the Policy Exchange and former Detective Chief Inspector at the Metropolitan Police. Really appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much.